The first sound was not the roar of traffic or the screech of tires. It was the sharp crack of a hand striking flesh, a sound that cut through the Dallas afternoon like a whip. Pedestrians froze mid-step. Horns went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the city itself had been stunned. That was the moment everything began to shift, not just for one man, but for an entire system that had forgotten what justice was meant to be. Ethan Cole had been sitting quietly in the back of a faded yellow taxi, wearing ripped jeans and a simple white t-shirt, a small rainbow pin fastened to his chest like a secret declaration of defiance. Beside him, his younger brother Alex scrolled through his phone, unaware of the tension brewing just outside their window. They were supposed to be shopping for groceries, an ordinary errand on an ordinary day. Yet in the space of a heartbeat, ordinary dissolved. The taxi had been stopped at a police checkpoint that sprawled across the wide boulevard. Sergeant Brad Miller loomed at the driver's window, sunglasses reflecting the city skyline. His voice carried that easy arrogance of someone who had grown too comfortable with power. He demanded paperwork, barked questions, and sneered when the driver fumbled for answers. When the man admitted he had left his documents at home, Brad's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. No insurance. No pollution certificate. He spat, "That's a fine. Or maybe your car gets impounded." The driver folded his hands together, knuckles trembling. His voice cracked as he tried to explain. To beg. To reason. He promised to return with the papers. Promised it was just a mistake. His accent marked him as an immigrant. His fear marked him as prey. Brad's reply was a blur. His hand flashed out and struck the driver across the face. The crack echoed down the line of cars. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The man's head snapped sideways, cheek blooming red, lips parting in shock as silence swallowed the street. Alex jolted upright in his seat, eyes wide. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the old familiar burn, the same one that rose years ago when slurs were hurled at him in school halls, when fists came down because he dared to exist. He opened the door and stepped into the heat. The rainbow pin caught the sunlight like a tiny flare. He walked toward Brad with slow, deliberate steps, heart hammering but spine straight. He was not thinking of titles or offices or the polished plaques that bore his name back at City Hall. He was thinking of the driver's eyes, glassy and wet with humiliation. "Who do you think you are?" Ethan said, voice low yet steady. "To hit someone just because they're poor." Brad turned toward him, startled that anyone had spoken. His expression twisted from surprise into scorn. "Get lost, kid," he snarled, taking a step forward, "or you'll be in jail right next to him." Ethan held his gaze, silent. The city noise began to seep back into the world horns, footsteps, whispers, but none of it mattered. Brad didn't know. He didn't know the man standing in front of him had the authority to strip funding from his entire department. He didn't know this quiet figure in torn jeans was the Deputy County Commissioner of Dallas, the official who signed off on the salaries that kept Brad's badge pinned to his chest. Ethan let the words die on his tongue. This wasn't the place. Not yet. He turned away, helping the stunned driver back into his seat. As the taxi pulled off, Ethan stared out the window, the slap still echoing in his skull. Justice had been reduced to intimidation here. It was time someone reminded them what it was meant to be. And as the boulevard slipped behind him, Ethan began to plan. If you believe justice should protect the powerless instead of shielding the powerful, follow Heart Stories, because stories like Ethan's are only just beginning. The morning air carried the dry hum of cicadas as Ethan Cole walked alone through the cracked concrete lot outside the precinct. He wore an old flannel shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots, the kind of clothes that swallowed identity. The rainbow pin had disappeared from his chest, tucked into his pocket where its sharp edge pressed against his palm like a secret reminder of who he was. Yesterday, he had stood in sunlight, daring to challenge Brad Miller in front of a stunned street. Today, he walked into shadow. The police station sat like a block of cold stone, its windows darkened, its flag limp in the heat. It was not the first precinct Ethan had entered, but it felt heavier somehow, like the building itself had learned to sneer. He pushed through the door, the smell of burnt coffee and bleach clinging to the air. At the reception desk sat Officer Chuck Mason. His boots were propped on the counter, a paper cup of coffee resting against his chest. He barely glanced up as Ethan approached. "I need to file a complaint," Ethan said evenly. Chuck let his eyes drag over him, slow and dismissive, before pointing at a clipboard with his pen. $200. Ethan blinked. "For what?" "For the form," Chuck said, almost yawning. "No money, no complaint. That's how it works." Ethan felt the heat crawl up his neck. "The law doesn't allow you to charge money to file a complaint." Chuck's grin spread, lazy and cruel. "You look like someone living off welfare checks. You think you know the law better than I do." Laughter floated from a table behind them where 3 other officers lounged with their feet up, sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones. No one paid attention. No one cared. Ethan's gaze swept the room and found nothing resembling duty, nothing resembling the oath they had sworn, only boredom, arrogance, and the slow rot of entitlement. He thought about the driver's trembling hands, about the look of shock when Brad's palm had connected with his cheek. He thought about how easily it could have been anyone, someone without a camera phone, without witnesses and without protection. People like that didn't stand a chance inside rooms like this. Ethan drew a slow breath, forcing his shoulders to stay loose even as his jaw locked. He pulled his phone from his pocket, typed one brief message, and hit send. "I'm ready." Then he slid the phone away, rested his hands on the desk, and spoke with the quiet clarity that only comes from absolute conviction. "If you don't write the complaint," he said, "I will write an indictment, and it will go to the state, not this department." The laughter stopped. Chuck's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back in place. He twirled his pen between his fingers, eyes narrowing as if he were deciding whether to mock or threaten. Ethan held his stare and didn't move. His heartbeat was steady now. He wasn't just here for the driver. He was here for every name buried in old case files, every voice ignored, every bruise explained away. The precinct was silent except for the faint hiss of the air conditioner. Ethan could feel the building watching him, the whole rotten structure holding its breath. He knew they saw a stranger, a man who didn't belong, who had wandered into their den without realizing the danger. They had no idea he was there to burn the rot from its roots. Justice, he thought, was not built on comfort. It was built on courage, the kind that walks alone into hostile rooms and does not flinch. The tension inside the precinct clung to the walls like humidity, thick and slow, pressing against every breath. Ethan Cole stood at the reception desk, his posture straight but unyielding, while Chuck Mason's grin sharpened into something meaner. Chuck's pen tapped against the countertop like a countdown, and in the corner of the room, 2 uniformed officers rose from their chairs. They moved with the casual menace of men who believed the rules bent around them, who had learned long ago that intimidation could masquerade as authority. "Escort him out," Chuck said, voice dropping into that soft register bullies used when they thought they had already won. The officers flanked Ethan, their boots heavy against the tile. He didn't shift. He didn't speak. He simply watched them approach, the kind of stillness that made people uneasy. Chuck tilted his head, as if savoring the moment, as if watching a trespasser about to be erased. Then the world cracked open. "Stop." The word cut through the room like glass shattering. Every head turned. The front doors swung inward on a burst of hot Texas air, and with it came a tide of polished shoes, clipped steps, and silent authority. A line of figures swept into the precinct, state prosecutors in tailored suits, senior officers from the Texas Department of Public Safety, and at their center, the director of the state police himself. Their presence was a jolt of cold electricity through the stale air, and conversation died on contact. Chuck's pen froze mid-tap. The 2 officers stopped short of Ethan, their shoulders stiffening as instinct caught up to arrogance. The director's gaze moved slowly across the room before landing on Chuck. His voice carried none of the heat outside, only the glacial weight of command. "The man you just attempted to remove," he said, "is Deputy County Commissioner Ethan Cole. He oversees the budget allocations for this entire district, including this department." The words landed like hammer blows. Chuck's face drained of color, the tan lines on his neck standing out stark against the sudden pallor. His mouth opened, then closed again, soundless. Ethan reached up and removed his sunglasses. The movement was quiet, deliberate, surgical. His eyes were steady, not angry, not triumphant, just impossibly clear, like glass polished by years of grit. "You wear a badge," he said, voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "But somewhere along the way, you started to believe the badge made you untouchable, that it excused contempt, that it excused cruelty. The law does not serve uniforms, it serves people, and it does not distinguish between a man in boots and a man in broken shoes." No one moved. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to hesitate. The officers who had risen to grab him now stood rigid, hands twitching at their sides. The other staff sank lower into their chairs, eyes darting anywhere but toward Ethan. He stepped away from the counter, not rushing, not retreating, simply moving as if gravity had shifted and he no longer had to fight for space. The prosecutors watched him like he was a lit match in a room of dry kindling. For the first time that morning, Ethan let himself breathe. This was never about spectacle. It was about pulling rot into the light, forcing those who hid behind their insignias to remember they were not the law, only its servants. As the silence stretched, a realization flickered in their eyes. Slow and dawning power is not what bends people to your will. Power is what binds you to their rights, even when it is inconvenient, even when it strips you of your pride. That was what they had forgotten, and that was what Ethan had come to restore. The precinct had fallen into a silence so brittle it felt ready to shatter under the weight of a breath. Ethan Cole stood with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to raise his voice. Around him, the delegation from the state held their positions like sentinels, their suits sharp and their expressions carved from stone. The director's presence anchored the room, but all eyes kept drifting back to Ethan, as though gravity itself had shifted around him. He broke the silence with words that landed like verdicts. "Officer Chuck Mason will remove his badge and sidearm." Now, Chuck's shoulders twitched as if yanked by invisible strings. His lips parted, soundless, then closed again when the director's gaze sliced toward him. The color that had drained from his face earlier had not returned. His skin carried the waxy sheen of disbelief. With hands that betrayed a tremor, he unhooked his badge, placed it on the desk with a muted clink, then set his weapon beside it. The sound echoed louder than gunfire. For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed to hum. This was the moment when pretended power began to curdle into consequence. The door at the far end swung open and Sergeant Brad Miller strode in, boots striking the tile with careless confidence. He was halfway through brushing the dust from his sleeves when his eyes caught the cluster of state officers, the cameras flashing from the hallway beyond, and the sharp silhouette of Ethan standing among them. His face faltered. "What's going on?" he asked, voice smaller than he intended. Then he saw the badge on the desk, the tension in the room, the unmistakable stillness of people waiting for judgment. His breath hitched. Wait, that man. Brad's eyes widened, darting to Ethan's ripped jeans, then back to his face, struggling to reconcile the image. "The other day, I thought he was just some troublesome gay kid." A heavy palm slammed the table, the cracks slicing through Brad's words. One of the senior officers from the state stepped forward, voice edged with steel. "That kid is the deputy county commissioner who controls the budget that pays your salary, and you struck a civilian in public view. That civilian was a taxi driver. The man you insulted was a federal official." Brad swayed as if the air had thinned around him. His jaw opened then shut again, the fight bleeding out of his posture. The bravado that had wrapped around him like armor only yesterday crumbled with each passing second. Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft enough to make everyone lean in, yet carrying the unmistakable tone of finality. This isn't because I hold a title. It's because you decided you were bigger than the system you swore to serve. The words threaded through the room like cold water through cracks in stone. Brad's lips moved soundlessly, but nothing emerged. A pair of officers from the state stepped behind him, cuffs glinting under the fluorescent light. Another moved to Chuck, who still stood frozen, his hands hovering near his sides as though reluctant to accept that this was real. Metal clicked, sharp and echoing, as both men's wrists were drawn behind their backs. The flashbulbs from the press outside pulsed like lightning through the glass, catching on every drop of sweat that now streaked down their faces. The cameras had been summoned as witnesses, and they recorded everything: the stiff march of boots, the muffled clatter of equipment stripped away, the collapse of men who had built their pride on fear. As Brad and Chuck were escorted out past the director, Ethan stayed still, not watching them, but watching the building itself. The cracked linoleum, the curling notices on the bulletin board, the hollow-eyed officers who stared at the floor. Authority, he thought, was never meant to be a shield from consequence. It was supposed to be a mirror, reflecting the responsibility of serving those with less. The moment that mirror breaks, what remains is not justice, only power rotting in its own silence. By nightfall, Dallas was glowing with the restless pulse of neon, but the precinct stood dark and hollow, its windows black squares against the glittering skyline. Ethan Cole watched from a distance as satellite trucks crowded the street, their dishes spinning skyward. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder under harsh white lights, voices urgent and eager. The story had leapt from local whispers to national headlines in hours. The footage replayed across every screen the moment Brad Miller's hand cracked across the driver's face. The grainy cell phone video of Ethan stepping from the taxi with sunlight glinting off the rainbow pin. The thunderous arrival of the state delegation. Clips looped like drum beats, relentless, until they became something larger than an incident, a reckoning. Hashtags bloomed like wildfires. Justice's pride trended in city after city, stitched into banners at late-night marches and painted across murals downtown by dawn. Students posted messages about standing up to abuse. Lawyers offered pro bono help to victims of misconduct. Even officers from other departments spoke out, cautious but clear, saying what many had whispered for years, that corruption had been left to rot because too few had dared to touch it. Inside the press conference hall, the air buzzed with the heat of 1,000 flashbulbs. Ethan stood at the podium, the rainbow pin once again on his chest, catching the light with each shallow breath. His hands rested on the wood as if anchoring himself to the present. He told them everything. He told them how, as a teenager, he had been dragged from a protest outside his high school, thrown against a patrol car by men wearing the same insignias that now lay on desks in evidence bags. He told them about the nights in the hospital afterward, the broken ribs, the laughter he heard from the hallway when the officers thought he was asleep. He told them how his complaints were buried, how his name was blacklisted from internships, how people muttered that he should stay quiet if he wanted a future. And then he told them why he had not stayed quiet. "I became a deputy county commissioner," Ethan said, voice steady though his knuckles whitened, "because I wanted to return here with more than anger. I wanted to return with power, not to punish, but to protect. I needed to prove that this system could be forced to look at itself and forced to change." The room had fallen silent, even the reporters lowering their cameras as if something sacred had entered the space. "Justice," he continued, "is not meant to shield those who hold power. It exists to guard those who live without it. If it ever forgets that, it stops being justice at all." When he stepped back, the silence broke like a wave. Applause erupted, echoing through the rafters. People rose from their seats, clapping until their palms stung. Ethan stood still and let the sound wash over him. Not as triumph, not as vengeance, as release. Somewhere beyond the hall, in living rooms and dormitories, in small apartments, where people watched alone, others who had been hurt in silence saw him and believed, maybe for the first time, that the system could bend toward them too. Ethan lowered his gaze to the rainbow pin on his chest. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like armor. It felt like hope. Do you believe justice should defend the powerless, not protect the powerful? Comment Pride and follow Heart Stories, because stories like Ethan Cole's are only the beginning. And together, we can make sure they are never silenced again.